Good afternoon, everybody. There are a number of folks jumping on as we speak right now, so we'll let that continue for a second before we officially begin, but we will start here very shortly. All right, it is 12:01, and so to be respectful for everybody's time, we'll go ahead and get started. I know we have more folks joining kind of as we speak, but we will begin our presentation today. So we thank everybody for joining us today. This is a continuation of our webinar series that we began last fall, focused on HPAI, providing updates, but also resources for growers in regards to the effort to respond to high-path avian influenza. And so joining us today, we have three highly regarded individuals regarding some hot topics and questions from you all regarding high-path. So first on our agenda is Jason Gilsdorf. So Jason, I don't know if you can start sharing your screen and get everything kicked off there. Jason works for USDA Wildlife Services. And so last spring, you guys heard us talk about, give a little bit of a teaser for the wildlife biosecurity audit that USDA was working on. And so over the past year or so, almost a year, they have been fleshing out what that biosecurity assessment looks like and also conducting a number of them across the upper Midwest. So Jason's going to share more about the program as well as how the assessments are conducted. So, and then we'll ask questions, Jason, when you're done. All right, thank you. And we can see your screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Gilsdorf. And Ashley, can you see in my screen and hear me?
You bet.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to come and talk to everyone today about our wildlife biosecurity assessment project that we with the USDA we kicked this off here this past fall, roughly in October is when we started this. And I'm going to talk a few minutes about what our project entails and actually give a little bit of a summary of kind of the first things we're starting to see as we have finished, completed a few of these assessments. So first, I want to mention that USDA Wildlife Services is a completely non-regulatory program. That means that we do not enforce any laws, we don't write any laws, or we do not write any kind of fines. We do two things, primarily two things. Number one, we can provide technical assistance and in the form of recommendations on how to deal with or manage wildlife causing damage or threatening human health and safety. The other thing that we can do in many cases is we can provide direct control. So that's actual wildlife management of wildlife that are causing damage in the field. So in terms of this assessment project, the goal is to help improve biosecurity of poultry farms and reduce the probability of transmission of AI from wildlife to domestic poultry. Currently, the assessment project is only taking place in Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Iowa on commercial facilities. We are not doing anything on backyard flocks, just commercial poultry facilities at this time. This wildlife biosecurity assessment has no impact or anything to do with any of the indemnity programs that are out there. There's maybe some confusion there where a certain type of assessment is required for indemnity, but this wildlife biosecurity assessment has nothing to do with any kind of indemnity claims or anything like that. And there is no cost to cooperators for an assessment of the farm. USDA is funding this through contingency funding. So there's no cost to the farm managers or the cooperators or anybody. So this first map here, this is from back in 2021, 2022, and it's showing the incidences of high-path AI in different birds during those years. Those red dots are commercial poultry facilities, and it's pretty obvious. You can see that cluster in Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Iowa. What we're looking at here is what initiated this wildlife biosecurity assessment project. So in Minnesota, we currently have 3 personnel on our staff. Myself, we have a biologist, and we also have a specialist. So we are currently trying to hire additional folks, additional specialists to be in the field to do these assessments. And looking at the map of Minnesota, don't get caught up here on the colors. We couldn't figure out how to turn the colors off on this. But what we're looking at here is those counties in red, the numbers associated with the counties are the number of poultry facilities in those counties. And you can see Morrison, Stearns, Candy, Ohio. There's quite a cluster in the central part of the state. Becker and Otter Tail are included in there as well. And if you look down in the southeast, just south of the metro area, you have Rice, Goodhue, and Steele, and Waseca County down there, Dodge. There's another little cluster of some numbers down there. So we look at this map, and this is what we're using to try to place personnel in the field in the areas where the majority of poultry facilities are. So to date, we started back in October, as I mentioned. In November, we picked up our 3rd person on the project. And since October, we have completed 15 initial assessments on farms. We just completed one follow-up yesterday, actually. And we're currently writing reports. I think we've got over 12 or 13 of these initial sites visit reports done now, but we're still writing some additional of the reports. So this is kind of a flow chart of the assessment project, what happens. So the first thing that we do, we as in Wildlife Services, we need to initiate a work initiation document. We call it a 12A internally. And what that is it gives written permission from the landowner for Wildlife Services to be on site to conduct the work. It can be a kind of a scary looking document. It's a couple pages long. And the reason it's a couple pages long is because it lists the species of wildlife and the tools that we may encounter or may use on the site. And to prevent requiring additional signatures, we have a very comprehensive list of species that we may encounter and tools that we may use. We may not see all the species listed. We may not use the tools that we listed, but we make it comprehensive because if anything were to change, if we see a new species or if we need to use a different tool, if anything changes on that, we have to re-sign that document. So we try to make it very comprehensive the first time. And once that gets signed, that's written permission for Wildlife Services to be on that property. An assessment consists of 2 things. Number 1 is a wildlife survey. We do point counts on the site. And I'm going to explain them a little bit more here in just a minute, but it gives us just a little bit of a snapshot of the wildlife that are present on the farm, the species and the numbers and the areas that they're using. In addition, the second part of the assessment will include an assessment of the barns and the farm in general, looking for any kinds of issues or attractants that we identified that could cause wildlife to be attracted to that site or gain access to domestic poultry inside the barns. That last bullet in the first block there, I will talk about a little more about that here in just a little bit. Opportunistic enhanced wildlife surveillance or sampling at hot sites where we're looking for high-path AI in wildlife on site. So the next thing we do is we conduct an initial report. After we conduct the surveys, we write out an initial report and we send that to the cooperator with recommendations. Go up to number 3, and then we do a follow-up site visit where we do the survey again, the wildlife survey, and we do an assessment of the farm and the barns, and we write another report. And that will have the survey information in it. The initial report just has our recommendations. It doesn't have any of the wildlife survey information in that initial report. And then we can discuss with the cooperator if we want to continue conducting these assessments. If we want to come back maybe every month, every 2 months, every 3 months, we can discuss with the cooperator if they would be interested in us coming back to continue the work. So I want to run through real quick the 2 components of the assessment. I mentioned the first thing is wildlife surveys. We do point counts. So in the picture there, you can see just a drawing of a hypothetical poultry farm with 4 barns on it. The wildlife survey consists of 3 separate surveys, a morning, a midday, and afternoon, and you can see the times associated with those there. The first thing we do is we look at an image of the farm, and we kind of pick how many survey points are we going to need to cover the area of the barns and the farm. The red stars in this illustration here would be our survey points. So in this case, we have 4 survey points established that we're going to stand and do a point count survey. We stand at each one of those sites for 3 minutes, and we identify any wildlife we observe or that we hear within a 100-yard radius of where we're standing. After 3 minutes, we move to the next site, and once all points are covered, that particular survey, like the morning survey, would be done. If we do see wildlife outside of that radius that we're looking at, we can document that as an observation. The second, or actually, this is the kind of an example of the data that we're collecting during that point count survey. Of course, across the top, we have the date, the name of the observer, the survey number, some weather information. And then you can see in the table there, we document the time we observed the wildlife, what survey point we're at, the species, how many there were, what they were doing, were they foraging, maybe they were loafing, were they in a tree, were they in grass, the kind of cover habitat they're using, and any comments associated with that observation. The second part of the assessment is an actual assessment of the barns and the farm itself. Between the surveys, between the morning and afternoon, and when we have time in between the surveys, we will walk around the outsides of the poultry barns. We only are on the outsides of the barns. We do not go inside the poultry barns, just the outside. We walk around the outside of the barns and we're looking for any kind of concerns, any issues that we might identify that could increase access for wildlife to domestic poultry in the barns. As we're doing this, we're also looking at attractants on the farm. Maybe there's some food or some water on site or nearby that could be an attractant causing more wildlife to be present, and we'll identify those. This is an example of what the form looks like when we're actually assessing the barns. Again, the date and time, where we're at, the observation, the location of where it's at. We can put a pin on a map, what type of a risk we're seeing or what kind of an issue or concern. And then we have a category. I'll talk about those in a minute, and any comments. We also will we can enter this into an app on our phone, or in some cases, we can have an actual printout of an aerial image of the farm, and we can manually mark points on that farm or on that picture, and then come back and enter the information into the app later. So an initial assessment typically takes 1 day. We show up in the morning, we meet with the point of contact at the farm, and we ensure that we're following all biosecurity protocols for that particular farm, and we'll conduct our first survey about an hour after sunrise. We do spend the day there between doing the surveys and the assessments of the farm and barns. If it's a large farm, more than maybe 12 or 14 barns, depending on the size and the layout, it may take 2 days. We might have to come back a second day. It just depends on the size of the farm. After the assessment, we go back to our office and we write the initial report. And this initial report is going to identify any concerns that we documented during the visit. We categorize our concerns into different biosecurity hazard tiers. We have 3 different tiers. Number 1, tier 1 being the most important, as that's likely a direct access for wildlife to access domestic poultry. Different categories we have: exclusion, that can be holes or in the mesh or netting, holes in the foundation, walls, any kind of way access or wildlife have access directly into the barns. And like I mentioned before, we're also identifying attractants, anything that could be attracting wildlife to the site. Food is the number 1 most strongest attractant for wildlife. If there's a source of food available to them, there's likely some species of wildlife utilizing that food. The second most attractive can be temporary standing water or a water source. And then third is like the habitat, any trees or any kind of vegetation around. The initial report will not have the survey information. That will come in the second follow-up report when we include our survey information in that. And because this is a pilot program, it's kind of new, we are completely open to any kind of information that producers or the industry or agencies may have to help us tailor these things to exactly what the poultry industry needs and to help them the most. So I want to take a few minutes here next and just kind of give you some examples of some of the more common things we're observing from the assessments that we've conducted so far. Compromise exclusion has seemed to be a pretty big top one. These are a couple examples here that we're talking. So that picture on the left, you can see there's 1-inch mesh across that air intake area. And if you look just in the upper left inside that circle, there's a larger spot there that would allow access directly into the barn from wildlife. And 1 inch is typically kind of a standard that we like to talk about because house sparrows are one of the more common species that we're identifying at the poultry facilities. And house sparrows can access anything that has a hole larger than 1 inch. European starlings and rock pigeons, or your typical city pigeons, are the other most common species that we're seeing right now at the poultry facilities. But that top right picture there, you can see another ventilation system where it's maybe an intake, and you can see the exclusion has detached from the bottom of that, allowing a gap where wildlife could access up inside an area that could give them access directly into the barn to the domestic poultry. That bottom center picture there, we have noticed quite a few times on the ventilation fans. Oftentimes there's issues with the louvers. In this particular example, they're just stuck kind of behind each other, but we have identified louvers that are missing or there's holes in them or damage that won't allow them to close. And if there's no exclusion on the outside or inside of that fan, that's a direct place where wildlife can access the barn. Oftentimes people will say, well, wait a minute, there's a fan spinning there. How are birds going to get in there? From our experience, we've noticed that the fans aren't always running, and we've actually identified and observed nests of birds on the motors of the fans. So they're getting behind those blades, and if that's the case, they potentially could get direct access inside that barn. Typically, the wire mesh on the outside of the fans is larger than 1 inch. Thus, sparrows and starlings could easily access those areas. Some other types of holes that we observe, and open holes are another big issue that we've identified. The picture on the left, of course, is some roof sheeting that has a gap in it. When we're out there doing these assessments, we can't say for sure that wildlife would have access inside the barns through that hole, but we don't know without looking in there, and we don't climb up and look in there. We just observe from the outside. Potentially, if a bird or an animal got through that hole, maybe it could go down 50 yards down the roof and maybe access inside the barn. But we always do like to identify any kind of open hole that would allow access to wildlife. The picture on the right, that's where the feed auger goes in to the barn from the feed bin. And you can see that sheet metal is bent a little bit, has a little larger hole than necessary. And in that particular case, you can see right inside the barn. And that particular hole is about 2 inches wide by about 6 inches long. Starlings and house birds could easily access a hole like that and be directly inside to the domestic poultry. Here's a couple of examples that we see underneath the rafters. Both these pictures, you can see the feces from obvious bird activity where they're accessing and using these holes to whether they're accessing the inside of the barn or just in the wall, and they're likely nesting. In fact, on that picture on the right, there actually was a nest just inside that hole. So in situations like this, we recommend excluding those areas, maybe put some expanding foam or some sheet metal across that to exclude animals from getting inside those holes. Breaches in the foundation have been another issue that we've noticed quite often. Whether it's deteriorating wood or sheet metal, it's becoming detached. We have noticed in some cases, again, we don't know for sure if animals can access directly inside the barns, but we don't look in there with a flashlight or nothing, but we just figure that if there's a hole like that, animals potentially could find their way into the barn and have direct access to the domestic poultry inside. So another thing we've documented quite often is spilled grain or spilled poultry feed that can serve as an attractant, as a source of food for wildlife. Oftentimes, of course, it's going to be around the feed bins. In the picture on the left, you can see that feed bin actually has a hole rusted through the bottom of it, and poultry feed was spilling out, providing a source of food for wildlife. On the picture on the right, in that situation, The feed truck showed up to fill the feed bin, and they spilt about 5 or 10 gallons worth of grain. In that situation, we actually observed starlings and blue jays foraging and eating the grain that was on the ground. So we do like to recommend cleaning up any kind of spilled grain around those feed bins or any kind of a source of food like that on or near the barns. I mentioned standing water, the number 2 most strongest attractant for wildlife after food. Water is a source of habitat for some species, like ducks, or for example, birds just bathe in it or drink in it. If a wild bird was using that water and they were shedding the virus, there's potential for the virus to be in that water. If equipment drove through that water or people walked through it and then accessed the barn, there's a potential there for a virus to go from the outside directly inside the barn. So in these situations, we like to recommend drainage be maybe cut into that area, or maybe some fill be placed in there to improve the drainage so that depression's not there. Another thing we look at is different kinds of habitat attractants around the site. Oftentimes we'll see trees or hedgerows planted. In some situations, birds are using those sites as roosting sites at night, or maybe nesting areas. Again, what we're doing is we're offering recommendations. We do not say you have to do this. So we may identify trees or shrubs or overgrown vegetation as a potential issue, and we may recommend that it be removed or maybe mowed to remove that attractant. Ultimately, in the end, our recommendations are just that. They're completely up to the property owner, whether they want to complete the recommendation or not. A couple other attractants that we're seeing are exposed carcasses, whether it be from domestic poultry themselves or dead or deceased wildlife in the area. These examples here on the left, we have a European starling that was inside the barn. It thought it could get out that vent there, couldn't quite get out, and it ended up dying there. The picture on the right, that's inside of a fan. At some point, European starlings gained access to the barn, and they were trying to get out, and they thought they could fly through that site. They went through the louvers, and the fan must have been on, and there was 2 dead starlings in that one. But anytime we identify a carcass on the site, we recommend removing that as a potential attractant for scavenging wildlife. So in these pictures here, we have a dead raccoon on the left, and you can see a dead mouse on the right. So just those carcasses on site can be attractants to attract other wildlife to the area. Sometimes we see nests of other wild birds. In this case, these are both barn swallow nests, but potential for a nest introducing a disease inside the barn from that bird just being that close to air circulation systems, intakes, vents, and that kind of thing. We do often will recommend removing nests as long as all state and federal regulations are followed in those cases. We do see a lot of proactive methods at the facilities. There's a large, I think basically everyone we go to does have a rodent control program of some sort with a bait stations, for example. The one on the right, we often see effigies near the feed bins. And that's great to see that kind of proactive thing is out there. People are trying to do something. Some of the drawbacks is, they do take some maintenance. The bait stations have to be maintained. They have to, put some new toxicant in those. And as far as effigies go, over time, they can lose their effectiveness. The animals will habituate or they get used to those being there. They never move. They learn pretty quickly that it's not a threat anymore. And sometimes they become inactive or ineffective, I should say. So when we write the report, I want to give you an example of how we report our findings. So the first thing I want to mention there is in red, you can see these reports are only sent to the cooperator. When we initiate the assessment, we coordinate with the cooperator and we will ask them directly, who do we send the reports to? And we will only send it to that person. If they tell us to send it to somebody else, we can send it to whoever, but they have the say on who gets the reports. We do not share these reports with just anybody. So in the report, what we're going to do is we're going to identify the concern. So in the picture here in examples, we're looking at compromise exclusion. The top two pictures there, you can see that wire mesh has been detached or has come detached from that fan, allowing a gap in there. And if you peek through it, you can see on the other side, there's an open louver inside there where if a bird got through that, they could potentially get direct access to the inside of the barn. So we identify the type of issue that we've observed, and then we provide a map of the barns, and each red triangle is a location where we observed this concern. So our idea is if we give this to the cooperator, they can look at that map and they know exactly where they would need to go to repair these issues if they choose to do so. So want to touch real quick on our biosecurity protocols for our employees. Number one thing I want to say is we follow all protocols at each facility. So if we have our own protocols, but if the farm has their own and they're more strict, we follow the most strict protocols of the facility. So ours in general for wildlife services, if we're going to be conducting an assessment at a clean site, a site that does not have high path AI, we require that our personnel, after conducting an assessment, they will not go to another poultry facility for 3 days for 72 hours. In some situations, a cooperator may say, well, our protocol is 78 hours. Perfect. We will not go to another site of their site until for 78 hours. So we follow the most strict protocols. Time between hot sites and clean sites, our wildlife services protocol is 10 days. Back in the fall of 2023, we had a decent breakout going on, as everybody's aware, in Minnesota. And we identified one person from our team, and that person went to the hot sites. If one of our employees was going to go from a hot site that had been depopped, they would not go to a clean site for at least 10 days. If it seems excessive and it's longer than what the cooperator requires, we will still go 10 days on our end. As far as hot site to hot site, like I mentioned, we identified one person that was actually doing assessments at hot sites. We go after the farm has been depopped. We understand that it's kind of hectic at that time. It's a lot of people around. Things can be emotional. We stay out of everybody's way. We will coordinate with the cooperator and the point of contact on site and ensure that we are following and they're ready for us when we show up. As far as going from hot site to hot site, we determine from the cooperator what the time in between they prefer. As far as prioritizing what farms we're going to, the current outbreak continues. We're still in a multi-year outbreak from the past couple of years yet. So our thought was to conduct these first assessments at sites that have been positive in the past year or so, and or maybe farms that have broke several times. And what we're hoping is maybe we can identify that farms that have went positive for AI, maybe we identify more concerns at those facilities as opposed to farms that don't break very often. Maybe we can show a difference there and give some recommendations for those sites to increase their biosecurity. Another thing we try to do is if we have facilities that are experiencing larger numbers of wildlife, we've called farms where they say, oh yeah, we have geese hanging out on our farm because we're right next to a wetland, or yeah, we have a lot of gulls hanging out in our barns. If there's more wildlife at those sites, we oftentimes will prioritize those as well. So because this is a pretty new project, we're looking at how we can get word out. And so far what we've come up with is we would like to attend different meetings, conferences, and conventions. We are planning at this time to attend and present at the Peak 2024 conference in Minneapolis this year. We like to attend any agency meetings from folks from the industry to help us get word out. And like I said, we're completely open to any other suggestions that people may have for us. I mentioned this real quick at the beginning. I want to touch real quickly on some enhanced wildlife surveillance. This is an opportunistic thing that we've done in the past at hot sites. So what we do is if a farm broke for a high path AI, the depopulation occurs, things have settled down a little bit, we will go to that site and we can actually sample wildlife on the site, whether it be birds and mammals, and look to see if we can find high-path AI in the wildlife on the site. We're almost kind of like looking for the smoking gun potentially by doing this, just to see if we can identify it in the wildlife on site. We have found that this has been, we've been limited by personnel in our availability to do this because we are pretty short staffed right now. We haven't been able to do this at multiple sites. This year, I think we did 2 in 2023, but as things move on, this might be another opportunity for us to look for AI at sites that are broke positive. So this is my last slide, and this is my contact information. My number, my email, and we also have my supervisor, Gary. He's on there as well, his number and email. If at any time anybody ever has any questions, comments, or suggestions to share with us, or if they would like us to come to their farm and conduct assessments, please feel free to contact me. We're creating a list right now to sign up folks and get to as many sites as we can. As I mentioned before, this is completely free service. There's no charge to the cooperators at all. So with that is the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions if we have any.
All right, folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type them in the Q&A or in the chat. But in the name of time, I don't see any in there right now. But we can also follow up. So we will share Jason's contact and Gary's contact information with everybody after this. And Jason will also, if we can get your slide deck and share that around, that'd be great as well. We can talk about that afterwards. But we will, again, this is obviously being recorded, and if folks have questions and want to go back look at what Jason had to say. But again, we will share his contact information with everybody in the entire membership. So thank you, Jason. That was great.
Great, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Next on our agenda is Dr. David Suarez from the USDA Southeast Poultry Research Lab. In the vein of high-path avian influenza, we do frequently get questions about vaccination, and we have had folks on previous webinars talk about the policy and political side of vaccination for high-path, and so Dr. Suarez will chat more so about the research side of high-path vaccination. So, Dr. Suarez, we can see your screen, and we can see. So there you go. If you want to start your presentation, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak and going into, there we go, slide mode. So first, we're obviously been working on vaccination for a long time here at Southeast Poultry, and a lot of the data that I'll be showing you, Erica Spackman, of the recent data, Erica Spackman conducted those studies. And then I'll also be showing you some older slides. I tried to make it as much turkey-centric as I can, but as you probably know, most of the studies are done with chickens, and I know that turkeys are not just big, bold chickens, and so there are some unique things about turkeys that we have to consider as well. So, this slide just, it's all I can say is it's been a bad fall and early winter, just based on the number of cases, very similar to what we had in 2022 as far as the number of cases. So although we had a great summer, the number of outbreaks really dropped off. It obviously is still in wild birds, and it is continuing to infect our turkey populations and chickens. So the studies that I'll talk about are two different studies that we did, both of them in chickens. And we'll just start out with the disclaimer that all this was funded through USDA APHIS money. So none of this was funded by the industry. And so although we don't endorse any specific vaccine, there's also not a conflict based on where the source of the money came from. Now, when we talk about the vaccines that we have available to us in the U.S., we actually have a number that are licensed and potentially could be used if it was approved by USDA and the state veterinarian, and including the HVT vectored vaccines. There's actually two different companies that are producing an HVT vectored vaccine. We have the reverse genetics vaccine that is based on the 2014-15 outbreak virus. So that's a 2344C insert, and that's about 5% different from what we're currently dealing with. There's the alpha virus vector vaccine. It was originally Harris, now it's Merck. We've actually tested the updated version of that, so that's a matched vaccine to what we currently are seeing circulate. And then there is a DNA vaccine that when we talked to the company, they weren't in a position that they could provide that vaccine to us, so we have not tested that additional vaccine. So those are the things that we have available to us, and we've tried to basically update to see how well these different type of vaccines would work against the circulating strains. And so that's essentially the two studies that we talked about. The first study was done in SPF white leghorns. That included an activated vaccine with an updated reverse genetics vaccine that we made in-house, as well as that 2014 commercial vaccine from Suarez that I talked about. And the RNA particle vaccine, which is an alpha virus vector, that was also updated with the 2022 antigen. So again, that's matching. And then we did a second study looking at the two herpes virus or turkeys recombinant vaccines. Both of those inserts and those vaccines are not super close to what we're dealing with. They're about 92-93% similar. And we did that study in both white leghorns and in broilers. So, the standard study that we've done for many years is for the killed vaccine and the RNA particle vaccine. We vaccinate them at 3 weeks of age. We challenge them 3 weeks later, and then we collect samples to look for virus shedding, and then we take serum at the end to see how well they seroconvert. For the HPT vector vaccines, we vaccinated those at day of age, challenged them at 4 weeks of age, and then did the same type of analysis. We use the same challenge virus for all of these, the Turkey Indiana virus, which is one of the early viruses. We really have not seen much difference in pathogenicity in any of the other viruses that we've looked at. But again, there's lots of reassortments out there. So there are some differences, at least that's been reported elsewhere. But this is as good a challenge as any for the studies that we're doing. So when we looked at the inactivated vaccine and the RNA particle vaccine in white leghorns, we saw that it was 100% protection for all the different vaccines. We didn't see any morbidity or mortality in any of these vaccines. We did see some virus shedding, which we always do with these studies. If you give them a high challenge dose, they will shed virus. And we did see some minor differences that the closer the vaccine was matched to the challenge strain, the better protection. That's not a new finding, but we saw it here as well. And so the internal reverse genetics vaccine looked like it did the best because that gives good antibody levels and it's 100% matched. So it generally, it historically provides us the best protection. But after 7 days, we didn't see any difference. Very little virus shedding at 7 days post-challenge. So nothing particularly unusual there. This is just showing the virus shedding data. So we're seeing about 10 to the 5th for the unvaccinated birds. And again, the RNA particle vaccine was a little bit the highest. And there was a little bit of statistical difference there. But again, the match vaccine, what we call the SEP22N9, was 100% match. I'll also point out, and I'll talk about that later, that reverse genetics vaccine has an N9 neuraminidase gene in there, which allows us to do some DIVA testing. The commercial vaccine is an H5N1, so there really isn't any DIVA strategies that are practical for when you have both when the neuraminidase is matched and it's a whole virus vaccine. You just don't really have much option there. All right, so again, all the vaccinated chickens, this is the HVT vector vaccine, so I'm switching gears. So in this one, we did both SPF white leghorn chickens, and then we also did commercial broilers, because we could hold the broilers for 4 weeks, which is for some of these other studies a little bit harder to do. For the vaccinated chickens and broilers, again, they shed significantly less than the sham vaccinated birds. We did see some differences, and I'll show you that in the next slide. That the insert, what they call the Cobra insert, it's a computer optimized design for the hemagglutinin that's inserted into this gene. Seemed to do a little bit better, but statistically there wasn't any difference between the two commercial vaccines that we looked at. Again, in the broilers, we saw the same thing. So there are a little bit of differences in the virus shedding, but overall we had good protection. Let me show you this first. So when looking at the survival in the white leghorns, again, and the broilers, so one of the vaccines, the Cobra optimized vaccine, had 100% protection in both groups. The other HVT vectored vaccine that had a clade 2.2 insert, the Swan Hungary insert, that had a 90 to 95% protection, which meant actually only one bird in each group died. So for the broilers, we only did 10 broilers. The white leghorns, we did 20. So we had one bird in each group die, which is where we get that 95 and 90%. Not a lot of difference in virus shedding between the different groups. And this is just showing that there really wasn't much difference. This is looking at the white leghorns with the two different vaccines, and the shedding data looks very similar between the two groups. And so I think there was some statistical difference in one day, but it wasn't a big difference between two groups. All right. So, I mean, the conclusion that we had from this part was that, all the vaccines tested provided good protection in SPF chickens. We still, based on previous work, and I'll actually show you some data for why that recommendation, certainly prime moose vaccination is still recommended for longer lived birds like turkeys, of course, to increase the immune response. I will talk about the DIVA surveillance, and so we have a little bit of data, and then I'll show you a little bit of data on the France commercial duck vaccination program, and just as kind of some background as well. So this is a study that we published back in 2017, which is really one of the few studies that we've looked at some of these different types of vaccines over a long period of time. And so this vaccine was using a reverse genetics inactivated vaccine, actually the same, the vaccine that I mentioned earlier. It's the same 2344C vaccine. And then we had the earlier alpha virus RNA particle vaccine that is, again, it's matched from the challenge. So there isn't any, it's a homologous challenge that the vaccine is matched to the challenge strain. What we did here is we vaccinated at 2 days of age, and then we boosted them at 3 weeks of age. And then we challenged them in either 6 weeks or 16 weeks. And then we followed them through. So, and then we in this group, or the data that I'm showing here, we included single dose vaccination. But what I'm showing you here is that we had 2-dose vaccination. So we did have either 2 inactivated vaccines. We had the alpha virus, then the inactivated, or 2 alpha virus vaccines. And then we looked long term. When we looked at the antibody, of course, we had the peak titers at 6 weeks. So 3 weeks after that second boost, that's the highest time point, or the highest antibody titers that we had were at that point. And by 16 weeks, the titers really come down quite a bit. It seems like I think the highest group that we had was the group that got the RNA particle vaccine, the alpha virus vaccine, and the reverse genetics vaccine. That seemed to have the longest enduring antibody. But again, it's not, a lot of this was not statistically significant after 6 weeks. But again, it shows you that the antibody levels do drop quite a bit. When we looked at the challenge studies with this at 6 weeks of age, again, we had very good protection, 90% plus for all the different vaccine combinations. But when we looked at the survival curve in the 16-week-old turkeys, again, and it correlates with the antibody levels that we had, the birds that got the alpha virus and then the inactivated vaccine did the best. The 90% of those birds survived. Only 70% of the birds survived that had the 2 inactivated vaccines. And the birds that got the 2 alpha virus vector vaccines did not, we only had 20% protection there. So clearly a drop off, less than 13 weeks, we're seeing a lot of drop off in protection, which shows that we are going to have to boost regardless if we want to vaccinate these long-lived birds. So let me switch gears. So, well, and again, this data I think is the best published data that we have out there looking at the duration of immunity. We don't have a lot of those studies. I am going back and looking at some other studies for inactivated vaccines in previous outbreaks with either low path AI. There's a little bit with high path AI in Italy. But again, we don't really see a lot of good long-term studies like this. So this is kind of unique. So, of course, why aren't we vaccinating now when I tell you that the vaccines are working? And obviously, it's a trade issue that if we decided to vaccinate, we wouldn't be able to trade for most or all the countries that we currently export to. And so the question is, can we make it so that we can convince our trading partners that even though we have vaccinated, that we can still have a product that we can demonstrate to them is safe and has not been exposed to avian influenza, or it's not been infected with avian influenza. And so that's the whole idea of the DIVA principle. So we really want to differentiate infected or vaccinated from vaccinated and infected animals. That's really what we want to show our trading partners. There's been lots of different ways that you can do this. Some of them, and I think we've narrowed it down to just a few options. There are a couple of serologic options, and I'll talk about that in a second. Obviously, we need a serologic test that is going to be inexpensive, reliable, high throughput. PCR is still going to play a role in this testing. Obviously, serology tells you what happened a week or more ago. It does not tell you what's happening in that flock on the day that you take it to the slaughter plant. And so it's going to be a combination of those two things, I think, if we're going to get our trading partners to accept it. For countries that do not export poultry, I'm telling them, DIVA is not their main concern. There is other surveillance that they should and could do, but they really don't need to try to meet DIVA standards if they're not going to export. All right, so the two different approaches that we have is that if we have a vectored vaccine, we're only expressing the hemagglutinin protein, then we can look for antibodies to the nucleoprotein. So the nucleoprotein, obviously, it's one of the internal flu proteins. It is not antibody to the nucleoprotein, is not protective at all. And it is, so although we're detecting it, and it is a proxy for seroconversion, remember, it does not directly correlate to protection because antibodies to the NP does not protect. Now, the good news is that we have commercial ELISAs. That's what we're doing surveillance with a lot in the US already. So those tests are available. So if we have a subunit vaccine, we can use those. Now, if we have a killed whole virus vaccine, then we have to go with the neuraminidase heterologous DIVA strategy. So again, I had mentioned previously that if we vaccinate with H5N9 and H5N1 is circulating in the field, then we can look for antibody to the N1 protein, and that is a marker that those birds have been infected with live virus, and it is not related to the vaccine. Now, the two different methods that you can use to look at neuraminidase antibody is one is an ELA test. So the neuraminidase is actually, it's an enzyme, and we can actually use the antibody to see if it blocks the enzyme activity. And then you can just use a kind of a standard ELISA, just looking for antibody that attaches to the neuraminidase protein. We do not have any ELISAs that are licensed in the US. There are some in Europe, and we have looked at those, and they are okay. Maybe not as optimized as we would like to see, but they could potentially be an option. So, and this is looking at the data, and the bottom line for this data, and this is the data from the first study. So we could only look at the neuraminidase part. We could look at both the RNA particle vaccine as well as the reverse genetics vaccine. And what we find is that the RNA particle vaccine, we could detect 100% of the birds that got challenged, they all seroconverted. The RNA or the reverse genetics vaccine, we had 70 to 75% seroconversion. And again, that is not surprising. The RNA particle vaccine did shed more virus, and more virus shedding meant there was more virus replication, which meant there was a stronger immune response. So we would expect that. And even in the birds, in the reverse genetics vaccine, we only had 75% conversion. Again, we were seeing much less virus, and some of those birds did probably not seroconvert because there just was not enough virus replication occurring because the vaccine was doing its job. Now, I'll point out, though, that when we looked at the MP ELISA test, again, the commercial ELISA that we have in the US, the seroconversion rate was much lower. In part is that the MP ELISA tests we're trying in the field, we certainly don't want to miss an infection, but we want to also avoid false positive detections. And so I think by design, they're a little bit less sensitive than some of the other methods that we can use. Now, the downside to this is that means that even though the birds may have been infected, again, we had 100% detection with the neuraminidase antibody, but we're only seeing, 50 to 60% protection. That decrease in sensitivity means we will have to just test more samples. We'd have to collect more blood samples and test more birds to have confidence, or have our training partners have confidence in that these birds were not exposed. And this is just looking at the data from the ELA versus the ELISA. Actually, a much more striking difference here. These were with the HVT vectored vaccines. ELA was picking up 100% of the birds had seroconverted, and on the ELISA, we only 5 to 50% of the birds seroconverted. So again, a big difference there, and it just means that we would have to test more birds if we were using the MP ELISA. All right, so again, we have a couple of different potential ways of doing DIVA. And the biggest issue is that we need to get these field validated and have our trading partners to accept this data. Otherwise, it's not going to be a good DIVA strategy. And again, we have 4 vaccines that I think, if used in combination, could provide good protection in the field. But are we going to start vaccinating soon? Doesn't look like that's likely. Based on our trading partners' acceptance of that. There are issues with these vaccines. Obviously, these vaccines would work better. Some of these vector vaccines would work better if they were matched to what's circulating in the field. Primary reason we don't have better matched vaccines is it costs the companies money to license them, to produce them, and they don't necessarily see the cost benefit to doing that. And so, we have to, the turkey producers are going to have to put pressure on them if they want better vaccines, that they're going to have to pressure them to do that. Obviously, we still don't have mass administered vaccines. Everything is by injection. And so that's still a problem. I mean, that's still an area that I think, is researchable. I think there are potentially options, but they're not short-term options. They are going to take time to establish. And the last thing is that lack of a vaccine market obviously inhibits innovative solutions. Just vaccination in France, of course, this is still ongoing. That they vaccinated about any flock that is of 250 birds or larger, 64 million birds total. They're using a baculovirus expressed vaccine, which again is not a very closely matched vaccine to what's circulating in the field. And this is not a vaccine that's available to us in the US. But again, it's primarily covered by the French government. And finally, I thought I had included that. And at least it's been reported in the press that at least 3 flocks have been that were vaccinated did test positive. I think one of those flocks, if I remember the details, that they had only gotten 1 dose of the vaccine. So they weren't fully covered, but they had been vaccinated at least 1 time. So, with that, I do of course like to point out that we have actually started vaccinating for high-path AI in the US. It's in condors, and this is the first time we have vaccinated any birds for high-path AI in the US. And so it's still ongoing. Right now, we vaccinated about 94 condors, which is about 1/5 of the population that we have out there. And to this point, we've not had any birds that were vaccinated have either serious consequences or been infected that we know about. All right. So with that, I will end it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
That was great. I don't know what everybody else thought. So if you guys have any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat. Otherwise, if you need to ruminate on it a bit and have questions later, let us know, and we will make sure we pass those questions along to Dr. Suarez. Thank you. So our closer today is Dr. Shauna Voss. Dr. Voss has been on every single one of these HPAI webinars that we've held the past couple months. And so we have a sincere appreciation for you, Dr. Voss, and always making time for our members and the work that you do, obviously, with the Board of Animal Health. So Dr. Voss, she needs no further introduction, so take it away. We can see your screen. So we're good.
Thanks. And I should just put this as not the best was not saved for last. So appreciate the other two speakers and the information that they provided. But I was asked to give just a real quick update on where we're sitting at with the HPAI response in Minnesota. And so as of today, from the start of our outbreak, which, as you remember, began on March 2022, so it was March 25th was when our outbreak in Minnesota began, we've had a total of 151 NVSL confirmed cases of high-path avian influenza, H5N1. You can see the breakdown here, mostly turkey operations, but we raise a lot of turkeys in Minnesota. We're here, we're number one, but we have had 2 table leg layer premises, 1 commercial broiler premises, and 36 non-commercial or backyard premises. And that occurred in a total of 45 counties across the state and resulted in 6.3 million birds being depopulated. As was mentioned earlier, we're not in this alone. The picture that I have on this slide is just from the USDA website, the outbreak as it stands with the last 30 days. So you can see that Minnesota is not alone in this. It's actually been over a month since we've had a detection in Minnesota. But a lot of the states, neighboring states, even in states to our south and coast to coast, have continued to have infections. And so we'll see what this spring brings, although I think spring happened about 3 weeks ago. And that certainly brings a lot of uncertainty with what may come with our influenza cases being tracked through wild birds. If we look at just what our fall cases were, so this was from our start of our fall outbreak, which began in October in Minnesota. We've had 39 NVSL confirmed cases, 23 commercial meat type bird premises, 10 commercial turkey breeder premises, 1 table leg layer, and 5 backyard premises. And this map just shows our total kind of cumulative outbreak across the state. So where we're sitting at right now with our high-path activities is all of our control areas are closed, thankfully, and all of that associated surveillance that's tied to those control areas has ended. We still have 1 remaining premises with active composting on site, but that should be wrapping up shortly. And we have 3 premises left that are pending environmental sampling, and that is anticipated to be done by the end of the month. So once those premises have had their sampling done, the lab has cleared those tests, quarantines are lifted, and those premises then are allowed to restock. And because all of that activity is diminishing, fortunately, we've been able to begin our demobilization process for our high-path response team. And as I've mentioned in previous webinars, excuse me, the Board of Animal Health is not in this alone. We work very closely with our partners at USDA, the Minnesota Department of Ag, University of Minnesota, and the Minnesota Department of Health. And so as those resources are no longer needed, we thank them for their service, and they can go back to doing their regular job, which is very important. And so that is ongoing. And then we are starting to work and look forward to what things might look like in the spring if we have additional cases. Just to give you a real quick update on the MPTL and VDL as far as testing information goes, there's been a slight change in the testing schedule planned for the Minnesota Poultry Testing Laboratory. So the routine testing for avian influenza Monday through Friday had been dropped off at noon, and the lab requested that that be pushed up until 11 a.m. to try to get all of those samples processed for a more timely run in the afternoon. So that hopefully shouldn't impact most of you, but just something to keep in mind. Sick bird testing, we continue to have staff on call to be able to do off-schedule testing and testing on Sundays at the MPTL. Those all require approval from the board and laboratory staff in order to conduct. The veterinary diagnostic lab in St. Paul, their routine testing does happen Monday through Friday at 7 a.m. So it requires a 7 a.m. drop off, or ideally samples being dropped off the afternoon before. And they are available for testing off schedule and on Saturdays with board approval. So we've still got you covered as far as any emergency testing that needs to happen. Just give us a call and we can make those arrangements happen. So even though it's refreshing to have a little bit of a break in Minnesota from HPAI, I want to just remind you guys to not waste that time that we've got in preparing for whatever may be coming. So we are still conducting the NPIP biosecurity plan audits through the board. Unfortunately, we fell a little behind with our HPAI event, so we're wrapping up our 2023 audits, but moving ahead and requesting audits for 2024. So now is the time to be reviewing your plans, making updates to your plans as needed, and most importantly, training on those plans and your protocols. So even if you've trained your staff before, you know, the University of Minnesota's research that they've done recently proves that additional training is required, and it's required frequently. So take this opportunity to make sure that you're training your staff. Even if you've done it 100 times before, now is a good opportunity to do it again. Also a good opportunity with theoretically a quiet time right now to do any building repairs and any wildlife mitigation measures that Jason was actually mentioning earlier in the call. And I know this isn't HPAI related, but I wanted to take the opportunity to address the other elephant in the room and the concern on the industry about avian metapneumovirus. NVSL has confirmed avian metapneumovirus subtype B on the eastern, in some eastern states. I've got those states listed. There may be more. I may not have those exactly right. And subtype A in California. And so there's still a lot of uncertainty with this, and no official announcement has come out, but it's been talked about pretty in depth within the industry. And so I just wanted to mention it here on the call that the Board of Animal Health is aware of the situation. For those of you who remember back when Minnesota had avian metapneumovirus in the late 90s and early 2000, you know, we dealt with that virus for about a decade, and it was avian metapneumovirus subtype C. So what they're seeing on the east and west coast is a different virus than what we had in Minnesota. But as a refresher for those who lived through it and for those who didn't live through it, the 1998 processing plant surveillance program had identified that anywhere between 40 and 60% of flocks were serologically positive for avian metapneumovirus. So it was a pretty significant disease impact in the state. And a vaccination control and eradication program was implemented throughout the years when we eventually were able to eliminate the virus from our turkey populations. Just a refresher on what avian metapneumovirus is. Hopefully we don't have to deal with this, but I thought it was a good opportunity to just remind people what to look for. This is a highly infectious respiratory disease that causes a disease called turkey rhinotracheitis or swollen head syndrome in broilers. And so most commonly identified between 3 and 12 weeks of age, and it's a respiratory disease. So you'll see coughing. Excuse me, I don't have it. You'll see inflamed sinuses or infected sinuses, conjunctivitis. So you'll get that inflammation around the eyes. And then the secondary infections are usually what kind of does these birds in. Secondary infections with either E. coli or ORT. And reportedly, mortality can be up to 30%. And I think this is what they are seeing out on the East Coast. For birds that are in production, you'll also potentially see a pretty marked decrease in egg production, poor shell egg quality, or egg yolk peritonitis. Just kind of for reference, avian metapneumovirus type C is the North American lineage that we've routinely had, mainly affects turkeys. Avian metapneumovirus A and B can affect not only turkeys, but also chickens. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of questions that still remain. So I don't know and don't have a lot of information on the disease prevalence right now. I don't know what's going to be expected for us on reporting. Avian Pneumovirus is listed on Minnesota's reportable animal disease list. But as far as reporting up to the federal level, that there still remains a fair bit of questions on that. And then certainly our response expectations. So, you know, if we find a case in Minnesota, what's going to be the action that we take? I mentioned this to you right now because I want to make sure that it's on your list of rule outs. If you've got a flock that's experiencing respiratory disease or an egg production drop or any unexplained mortality. And I'm currently working with the Turkey Growers Association and the University of Minnesota on trying to assess if we need to have a coordinated active surveillance program. And if we do, how do we make sure that we get those costs covered? As a reminder for what we did, 20, 25 years ago, we were doing some active commercial surveillance, excuse me, for commercial birds, and that ended in 2010. And our breeder flock surveillance ended in 2018. Excuse me 1 minute. Just so you guys know, the testing protocols that we have in place at the MPTL and the VDL for avian pneumovirus looks at subtype C only. So that's what we had in Minnesota. That's what our tests were developed for, and that's all they will look for. So if we have an A or a B circulating, we're not going to pick it up with the current tests that we have, but the university is being pretty proactive, and they're working on expanding their testing methods to be able to test for all subtypes. And so I would expect that those would be available here within the next couple of weeks, or for sure by the end of the month. So again, stay tuned on this. There's probably going to be more information to come, but just making sure that it's on your radar. And then I'll end with the final slide as to always how to report. If you suspect you've got something, we've got our avian influenza hotline. We've got an online sick bird report form. And then for you guys, commercial birds, call me directly on my cell phone if you need to arrange some testing or you suspect that something's going on with your flock. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna, as always, timely and relevant and excellent information. If there are folks who have questions, we are just a freckle over an hour now, and we try to keep this as close to an hour as possible. So if you guys have questions, you can go ahead and let us know now quick. Otherwise, feel free to follow up with anybody from the Minnesota Turkey Growers Association team, and we will pass those questions along. We will follow up this webinar with the recording, but also contact information for our speakers so you can contact them directly. And I want to give a special thank you to everybody who joined us again today. We will likely continue this webinar series into the future. We may shift a little bit from HPAI into maybe some avian pneumovirus conversation, but we will continue these educational webinars on a monthly basis going forward. And with that, thank you everybody for joining us today.